Welcome again, everyone. I'm really pleased for you to join us this morning for this webinar, and we appreciate your time in attending. So I'm Declan Conway. I'm the co-director of CSEP, the Centre for Climate Change Economics and Policy, which is funded by the ESRC, and it's co-hosted by the University of Leeds and the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the LSE. So it's a pleasure to welcome you all to this webinar, and it's the launch for a new CSEP report, which is titled Preparedness, Organisational Preparedness for the Physical Risks of Climate Change in the UK. And the report captures some of the headline findings and recommendations from a very recent national survey. That national survey repeats surveys and expands on some that were completed in 2010 and 2013, commissioned by the UK DEFRA. So we're keen to present our results. We hope that they're timely, given recent experience in terms of extreme events in relation to climate, in terms of very high profile around climate change, policy, politics, economics and impacts. It's been quite some time since the last national survey on this topic, so it's interesting for us to reflect on some of the changes that have happened. We're also in the run-up to COP26, and it's not too far before the third National Adaptation Programme will start. That's due to run from 2023 to 2028. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome our speaker and our panellists. As first presenter, we have Professor Suraje Dessai from the Sustainability Research Institute at the University of Leeds. And Suraje is also one of the champions for the UK Climate Resilience Programme, and he's going to tell us a little bit about the results from the report. And then we've got three panellists who will speak after Suraje. Firstly, Dr. Louise Wilson from the UK Met Office. She's in the International Climate Services team. And then secondly, Katie Jenkins, who is with UK DEFRA. She's a senior policy advisor and with a remit for business and infrastructure and climate adaptation. And then thirdly, we have Dr. Nicola Ranger, who's Deputy Director of the UK Centre for Greening, Finance and Investment and Head of Climate and Environmental Risk at the Oxford Sustainable Finance Programme. Okay, so that's our panelists and our speaker. I'll aim to try and finish at 11 o'clock, just to let you know that the event is being recorded and we hope to upload it to the website as soon as possible after the event. The report and some other relevant web links will be uploaded into the chat, so you can have a look and follow up on various bits and pieces there. And please do give us some questions in the Q&A box, and you can vote for those questions, the ones that you would like to prioritize. So as the presenters and the panelists speak, then do be thinking about some questions that you would like them to address. After the panelists, we'll move to a Q&A session, and we'll then wrap up on the hour. So thanks very much. And without further ado, I'll hand over to Suraje. Thanks, Suraje.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Declan. Can you just confirm that you can see that slide?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming. It's a great pleasure to present on behalf of my co-authors as well, Denise Dookie, who's here, and Declan Conway, who you've just heard from. I'm going to give you a whistle-stop tour, really, of some of the high-level findings of the report. So just to give you a little bit of background, PREPARE stands for Programme of Research on Preparedness, Adaptation and Risk. And as Declan said, that was a program that ran in 2012 and 2013, was funded by DEFRA. And they actually had run a previous survey as well in 2009-10 in the winter. And both those surveys were done through telephone. So it's a slightly different method to what we've done now in the spring of 2021. So this was covering April and May. So the survey ran for about a month. And it was conducted online. So that's the major difference that needs to be sort of taken into account when looking at some of these results. We had more questions than the previous surveys, but we repeated some of those questions so that we were able to do some comparison. We had quite a big sample there of just over 2,400 individuals who sit in organizations. So we were screening folk by their job title, really. So they had to be involved in organizational planning. And what you can see here on these pie charts is some of the samples. So the large majority of the sample is from the private sector. Like the previous Prepare surveys, we have a little bit of representation from third sector, health, education, and a few local authorities as well. And you can see a sort of relatively even distribution of sizes of organization. When it comes to country, the large majority of the sample is from England. We have a little bit of representation from the other nations. And then again, within England, a very big proportion comes from London and the Southeast, with some representation from the other parts of the country too. You'll find in the report this diagram that Denise put together initially, and we've been building on this. It's useful to just, I guess, have a little bit of perspective on developments since, since the Climate Change Act came into force in 2008, and you can see, where those Prepare surveys were done in 2009, 2010, 2012, 2013, and Prepare 3, which we've just released, comes at a time that there have been a lot of recent changes since Prepare 2. So, for example, I'll just highlight a few. The Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures was established, so there's a big drive to disclose both transition risk and physical risks, which is the focus of this particular report. There have been more IPCC reports, the 1.5 report, calling for action. And there's been a lot of action in the finance sector, and I'm sure you'll hear more from Nicola on this, a green finance strategy, very recently a roadmap towards mandatory climate-related disclosures coming from the Treasury. So there's certainly a lot of impetus in terms of getting organizations to prepare for a changing climate. So I think this report is quite timely in at least giving us a little bit of a peek in terms of what is happening. And I'm sure Katie Jenkins will talk a little bit about the adaptation reporting power, and this is the third one that's happened, and some of these things will come out next year, which again will give us a better assessment of how the UK is prepared for a changing climate. And finally, what came out in the summer as well, very relevant, is the Climate Change Risk Assessment independent report that the Committee on Climate Change did, where again, there's a chapter on business, which is particularly relevant here. So this is the backdrop of this report. I'm going to go straight into some of the findings. So one of the things we asked is just to really put climate change in context of other risks. And you won't be surprised to hear that the pandemic was ranked first and the economic downturn second. But the effects of climate change were fifth in some of the concerns of these individuals in organizations, so above Brexit. And then you can see a little bit further down, there's a few other very relevant concerns about the physical risks of climate change, effects of climate change overseas, and preparations for extreme weather. So it's interesting to see how, climate change sits amongst the other issues. And some of these results are sort of consistent with other public surveys, for example, run by Cardiff University in the past. When we look at the actual hazards, so extreme weather events, this plot here is showing you whether individuals perceive these hazards as a threat, a big threat, or an opportunity, or no real difference. And you can see that there's definitely a signal here around flooding, either due to heavy downpours or through coastal flooding, and also associated with heat waves. There are definite concerns about that. And then on the other end of the spectrum, for example, a very mild winter is perceived as a little bit of an opportunity by some organizations. So that provides a little bit of a picture of what's the hazards perception by organizations. We asked participants if they've been affected by the impacts of extreme weather events in the last 3 years. So the results you can see here are from our survey in 2021, and you can see that there's quite a high percentage of organizations saying that they have been affected by extreme weather events. And then you can see the types of events that they have been affected. So flooding, intense heat waves, very wet and rainy winters, and particularly warm summers, for example. And this is one of the results that I will actually show you a comparison between 2021 and 2013, because there is actually quite a big difference here. There are definitely more organizations experiencing the impacts of extreme weather events, so almost a doubling here from 31 to 38%. And while for flooding, it's pretty much even when you look at some of these other risks, particularly, for example, heat waves, but also a lot of these heat-related hazards have really gone up quite a bit. So organizations are starting to feel that a lot more compared to the results we had in 2013. So we asked them a bunch of other questions around, for example, what were their perceptions of the impacts? So the large majority thought the impacts were negative, 70% of them. And then the impacts were being felt on the workforce and customers, but also in the premises. And most of the impacts were felt either in the first few days to weeks, but there were some of the sample also was feeling effects, months up to a year after the extreme weather event. And this was particularly the case in local authorities. So there seemed to be a lag in the impacts. And there were a raft of things that the organizations told us they were doing to manage the impact. So some of it was around knowledge transfer, capacity training, investing in new technologies, making an insurance claim, which is an adaptation strategy, well-known one. And then there were a few things that are actually very costly as well, like decreasing production capacity. So that was worrying that there were, severe impacts as well. And we found that about 22% of organizations were taking action, but about 65% in the private sector weren't taking action to deal with the impacts of climate change. We asked them as well about their planning for climate change, and this question was around, how much they agreed with this particular statement. And so what you can see here is a bit of a scale. From the top here in my mouse, I'm showing you organizations that say that they've comprehensively assessed both present and future hazards and risks, and they've planned and they're taking action. So you can see that there's about 12% of organizations that are sort of in this category that have really done the work and are sort of generally on their way to taking action and doing things. And so you can see a large majority of organizations either are in the beginning of trying to assess climate change. And so what's particularly worrying, I guess, is this part of the spectrum where organizations, haven't thought about it, and some of them haven't really, aren't planning to do anything about it as well. So there's definitely scope to influence some of these organizations in terms of action. In terms of planning, these are the type of hazards that the organizations are mostly considering. So flooding, heat waves, storms, snow and ice as well. So these are fairly consistent with some of the previous slides that I showed you earlier. We asked a little bit about the barriers to adaptation. So what's preventing them from taking action? And individuals told us about financial resources being a particular constraint, but also just staff attitudes to climate change, and also difficulties in identifying what are effective measures, and there's a raft of other barriers that you can read about in the report, but those were the most critical ones in the top there. In terms of responsibility, we also asked whose responsibility was it to manage the impacts of climate change, and this plot shows quite a mixed picture here, but certainly national government was being talked a lot about in terms of having some responsibility about managing the impacts of climate change, but also then the international community. But then some of the other key players as well, local authorities, businesses, communities, and so on. So it's quite diversified as well. We also asked what could governments how could government better support adaptation? And the responses that came back were particularly around providing more information about the effects of climate change in the UK, funding, subsidies, tax breaks, which is consistent with what we saw a little earlier, but also to try to show how climate change is relevant for their organization in particular. So these are potentially some of the things that government could pick up to try to enhance preparedness in the sector. And in the context of information, one final thing that I'll show you before moving on to our recommendations is around climate information. So on the left table there, you've got from those who've been impacted by climate change, we asked them, where do you get your information to help you cope with some of these impacts? And so we got people telling us about colleagues, insurance companies seem to play an important role in advising how to deal with the impacts. The Met Office is mentioned, but also government literature and the climate change risk assessment that was mentioned earlier. And then we asked as well on the right, you can see what are the types of sources, how often do they get used? And you can see government literature being particularly important. And then we also asked a little bit about the reliability. So how reliable are some of these sources? So we can get a sense of, who can communicate some of these messages to organizations. And so they were telling us about academic sources, Met Office, environmental regulator. So hopefully this is quite useful information to inform future campaigns around information provision. So that was a very, very quick tour of the results. Do look at the report for more detail. I'll mention just a few of the recommendations that we have written out in the report. And one of them is around these surveys. So one of the things we've recommended is that a particular body, it could be the Committee on Climate Change, it could be the CDI, for example, or another cross-cutting organization that has a cross-cutting role. It would be very useful to coordinate periodic surveys so we can get an assessment of the preparedness of organizations and hopefully run that parallel to for example, the Adaptation Reporting Power. And the Carbon Disclosure Project, for example, has done something similar in that space globally for a while. We also recommend that these longitudinal surveys need to be complemented by qualitative data to try to unearth some of the whys. I think we can go a certain way to explaining some of the results that we're seeing, but follow-ups with, for example, interviews, I think will give us some more understanding of why perceptions may have changed, for example, throughout time, or and so that's something we're looking into trying to do. The hazards that we found of most concern and the people are planning are quite consistent with the CCRA. So this diagram here on the right is from CCRA 3, the business chapter. So it is about flooding, it is about heat waves, it is about also disruption into the supply chains. So the concerns of organizations are quite consistent with what the technical and scientific report are telling us. So that should definitely be used in communication campaigns, but they should be tailored. And I didn't have time to show you, but some of our data enables some analysis spatially over the UK. So there are some differences between the different countries and regions, and there are a few differences as well through sectors. So tailoring is going to be quite important. And then the last two recommendations that we've got in the report relate to assessing the economic impact of these extreme weather events that organizations are feeling. That's going to be very important to make the case internally and I think across the sector in terms of adaptation actions and to target initiatives. And then finally, organizations see quite a strong role for leadership from the government and collective leadership on adaptation. So that's maybe one more area where we need to do more. So I think on that point, I'll stop there, Declan, and hand over to you.
Great, Suraje. Thanks very much for that summary of some of the headline findings. As Suraje says, there's a lot in the report, so it's quite difficult to pull out and highlight just some of the key things. So please do take time to have a look at it and browse through. I'm going to move now to our panelists and ask them for a few thoughts from their own perspectives, having looked at some of these results, and to think about those in relation to their responsibilities and issues that they think may arise. Please do take the time to put some questions into the Q&A, and we'll take those after the panelists have spoken. So firstly, I'd like to invite Louise Wilson from the Met Office. Over to you, Louise. Thanks.
Thanks, Declan. And first of all, thanks to all the authors for this really important and quite insightful report on organisational preparedness to the physical risks of climate change. I've worked towards effective climate adaptation in Australia and more recently in the UK, and having this kind of longitudinal view of the preparedness of business is really valuable for national adaptation planning, and is a really good asset for the UK. From the report, it struck me, that there's a general awareness that climate risks need to be understood and prepared for, but only about half of businesses surveyed identified that physical risks associated with increased severity of national disasters was a priority driver for their organisation in addressing climate change. And only a very small percentage have actually assessed these risks and formulated adaptation plans. And so the question is, why aren't more businesses focusing on resilience and climate adaptation? Is it because of a lack of information and understanding? And the survey respondents did indicate that one of the most useful avenues of government support for adaptation would be to provide more information about the effects of climate change in the UK. And they did indeed identify the Met Office as one of those reliable sources of information. So, as you'd be aware, the Met Office contributes to UK preparedness through multiple avenues, including monitoring the state of the climate and providing early warning services and seasonal forecasts, as well as the production of national climate projections, which is data and information about what a changing climate might look like for the UK, and that can be used to assess risk. Climate change is a global challenge, and the Met Office also works with governments internationally to assist other countries and nations to understand the risks they face and build their resilience too, including, for example, in Asia and in Africa through the Climate Science for Services strategic partnerships, but in many other engagements as well. Locally, the Met Office provides services for civil contingency and resilience communities as part of the National Resilience Network. And this is things like information to inform plans, minimising the impacts of severe events when they do occur, and helping coordinate and target response efforts so that they can be conducted safely. The Met Office also contributes to the CCRA evidence reports and provides tailored services to different industry sectors as well. Recent work includes the very high resolution UK climate projections, which are at 2.2 kilometre resolution, which were released just recently. And these provide information to government, but also business at local scales, which can be combined with information about the impacts that are happening already now to help make decisions about how to respond and what adaptation options are available. So, for example, the State of the UK Climate Report released in July this year noted that temperatures are rising with nearly a degree of warming across the UK in the last 30 years compared to the previous 30-year period. And we saw some significant extreme weather events in last year, including a major heat wave in the southeast in early August. And by the end of the 21st century, projections indicate that all areas of the UK are projected to be warmer, more so in summer than in winter, with hot summers more common and with an increase in the frequency of hot spells or heat waves with consecutive days with temperatures topping 30 degrees Celsius. As well as increasing temperatures, the UK has been getting wetter overall. 6 of the last 10 years have been the wettest years on record. And last year, several records were broken for the wettest days on record, with severe and widespread flooding in February due to the storms Kira and Dennis, which arrived only a week apart with their associated impacts. And the evidence tells us that these wet days, these very, very heavy rainfall days, are getting wetter themselves, especially for Scotland and in the north of England. And whilst we might see some drier summers into the future, the intensity of these summer rainfall events, usually associated with summer storms, are expected to continue to increase. Coming with them will be more surface water flooding. So it's important to remember as well that the impacts of these extreme events do last for much longer than the duration of the events themselves. So floods, fires and droughts, well beyond the end of the actual event. You know, businesses and government are dealing with the impacts and the after effects. And so climate adaptation is really critical because we're already locked into some warming and these impacts are happening here and now and will, you know, continue to impact in the future. So the Met Office does have an important role to play in climate adaptation through providing information, you know, that I've just described, but there's also a lot of important work to be done to translate this science and these impacts into information that's actually actionable and that's risk relevant and that businesses can use and integrate with their other business risks. I'll leave it there. Thanks, Declan.
Okay, thanks, Louise. That's great. Good sort of overview of the information and services that are going to be very relevant for this agenda as we move forward. So moving to our second panelist, Katie Jenkins, over to you to give us a perspective from DEFRA. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Declan. I'm just sharing my screen. Hopefully you can all see the slide that I put up on the statutory framework. Fantastic. So thanks for having me. Great to be here to discuss this incredibly important issue. It's quite striking, the findings within the survey around people's views about the role of government. And of course, government does have a role in managing climate risks, and that is currently enshrined in the Climate Change Act 2008, which sets out a kind of 5-yearly cycle of government receiving independent advice from the Climate Change Committee, responding to that advice and preparing a national adaptation programme, which Declan and others have alluded to in their introductory comments. So the slide really just sets out what that statutory cycle looks like. And of course, another key part of it is the adaptation reporting power, which enables the Secretary of State to direct infrastructure providers and other organisations of a public nature to provide reports to government on how they are managing climate adaptation, how they're managing climate risk. We are into the third round of that. It is a voluntary process this time round. The first round was not voluntary, but the subsequent rounds have been. But we have seen a really good take up of organisations who are providing reports to government. And the current reporting window closes at the end of December this year. So we will have a large number of reports coming into government at the end of this year, and we will seek to publish those as quickly as we can at the beginning of next year. And yeah, this is a key kind of tool by which government can encourage the integration of climate risk management into the way that companies operate. And so another of the findings that I found quite striking from the survey was the kind of infancy really of climate risk management amongst a large kind of cross-section of businesses, and sort of perhaps the need to do more, and the need to consider ways in which the adaptation reporting power can be utilised in future rounds, perhaps extending it across a wider cross-section of the economy. And these are things that we will want to think about in terms of the options that we consult on for round 4 of the adaptation reporting power. So the survey is a really useful input to that. I think that's probably all I have to say in terms of introductory comments. We do have a lot of information coming through in adaptation reports from infrastructure providers, but they are the big ones. They are the kind of large water companies, large energy companies, transport providers and others. And it is interesting to think about how do we encourage more businesses, right from the smallest businesses up to the largest businesses, to think about how they're managing climate risks. I think the survey poses some really interesting challenges to government, and it makes for some really interesting reading. So thank you.
Thank you, Katie. That's great to get your perspective on this. Lots of challenges and opportunities in the coming years for us to get to grips with this. So over to our third panelist, Nicola Ranger. Thank you.
Thank you, Declan, and again, let me thank and congratulate the authors of this report. An absolutely brilliant piece of work, and thank you so much for what must have been a huge effort to put it together. It's a really valuable piece of work. So I'm going to sort of pick up on two bits that were that I found particularly striking in the report that I wanted to connect to some of my reflections on it. One, and perhaps this didn't come out in the presentation that we heard from Suraje, but is in the underlying report, and I definitely encourage the audience to read the underlying report because there's a huge amount in there. So what the first one was about how people's attitudes to climate change seem to change during COVID. And now this isn't a surprise, but I think that I think it's a really important finding that climate change sort of went down in people's list of priorities. Now, obviously, that's not a total surprise. Certainly in the last year, my priorities have been slightly shifted as well. But I think it was a surprise to me because for me, actually, COVID has made me more worried about our preparedness in the UK to climate change, much more worried. And I'll come back to why in a moment. The other, I think, really interesting point that I found in this was people's views on the barriers to adaptation in the UK and the barriers to taking action, which were one, the financial resources that they have. So 45% of respondents said financial resources were a key barrier. The second one being complacency, 29% put complacency. And then coming into how to resolve those barriers, legislation was seen as a really key thing that needs to change. So that being something that can help overcome some of these barriers, having legislative obligations on firms. Now, where this comes into my points then. So firstly on COVID. So certainly I think one of the things that we've all learned from COVID is about how different risks are interconnected. Climate change will not happen in isolation. And I also feel that when we focus too much on the key risks being floods or these individual risks, we kind of miss what could potentially be some of the biggest and earliest risks from climate change, which is climate interacting with other things that are going on in the economy and globally. At the moment, we're seeing in the UK big disruptions to our supply chains in several key sectors. So if I was going to say, what things really worry me, it's those kinds of effects. And I think one of the challenges is at the moment that we don't, we have very little understanding of those sorts of effects because they require a very different sort of information and very multidisciplinary approach to really look at those types of risks. And I think that in the way that we are assessing risk in the UK, but also globally, and I do think in the UK we're very much ahead of other countries, we miss that compounding, cascading type risks, which we know can be big amplification factors. So that would be the first point that I would like to make. Then two further points. So one is around, so both my next points will be around finance, which is my focus at the Centre for Greening Finance and Investment. One is on the fiscal side. So as Suraje mentioned at the beginning, a number of really great things have happened in the past years, both on the fiscal side and on the financial side. On the fiscal side, one of the great things that happened is that the UK for the first time actually included climate change in its fiscal risk assessment. Now, this may seem like a sort of small analytical point, but this is massive. This is the UK recognising in its fiscal risk management that climate change is a threat to the UK and including that. And that filters down into a number of different government decisions at the core of government's financial decision making. So that was a really, really important step. And from that comes understanding what are the contingent liabilities on the government. So what is the government actually responsible for? And then what are individuals responsible for? And what are businesses responsible for in managing these risks? And that's really important. And it comes back to some of these barriers that were identified around complacency and the need for legal obligations, because it's that's where risk filters down. Understanding who owns the risk, who is responsible for the risk is absolutely critical. So I think that's a massive thing that happened in the UK that we should see filtering down into a number of different areas of policy. My next point then, my final point would be on the finance side, which is obviously one of the other barriers, this 45% of respondents saying that finance was a barrier. And as Suraje mentioned, a lot of great positive things have been happening in the UK in terms of integrating physical climate risks into the financial sector. And this is really important because that is needed to provide the financial products that people need to adapt, but also to build in strong risk pricing signals into things like insurance, into when you take out a mortgage, that you get an incentive to invest in adaptation in your property, for example. So that financial incentives is really critical in terms of overcoming some of these barriers. Now, a number of positive things have happened. The mandatory disclosures on financial institutions that Suraje mentioned, the green finance strategy. We'll see a huge amount coming out at COP in a couple of weeks. And then on the central bank side, the Bank of England running its first climate stress test for banks and insurers, which was a really, again, this is all about getting risk into that heart of financial decision making. But that does come with a trade-off, because as soon as the financial sector starts incorporating physical risks, that means that some people are going to have to bear this additional cost, and that is going to hit some of the poorest people in society most, unfortunately. So there again is an important role for public policy in overcoming that. So we need these economic incentives, but we also need public policy. And they're just sort of a final point is one of my big focus areas, particularly for COP, is showing that we need all of these discussions that we're having around mitigation and net zero. We need the same to happen for adaptation. We need a real discussion about how do we bring more finance into adaptation in the UK and globally? How do we align finance with the needs of adaptation and resilience goals? So I think that's, for me, that's a big next step and something that I'm particularly focused on at the moment. But I'll leave it there. Thank you. And thank you again for this excellent research.
Thanks very much, Nicola, on the part of all of us who've been involved in the report. That's very pleasing to hear that. Okay, so I'm going to move straight to the questions that we've had from you in the audience, and please do keep those coming. But we have a few here. I'm going to take the first, which has come through from Susie Arnott, who is a freelance carbon literacy trainer. And they ask, is there an obvious first step to point businesses towards preparedness and adaptation isn't part of our trainings, but an upcoming business improvement district cohort would surely benefit from some guidance. So perhaps, I don't know, Suraje or Louise, if you can think about the first port of call for thinking about how to get to grips with this agenda, because as we know, for many people, it is very new.
Yeah, I'm happy to kick off on that, Declan. A few things come to mind. So there have been some tools, for example. So we used to have something called the UK Climate Impacts Programme. So the website's still there. and they did provide some tools, for example, for local authorities in terms of how to get their head around climate change. But there was also a bit of an adaptation wizard to try to guide folk through some of the key to, critical elements, assessing current risks, so how vulnerable is the organization to climate change, what's going to be the future risk, then assessing the strategies, then implementing the strategies, and then you go through that loop, so sort of climate risk management type loop. So that exists, but I think there have been more developments since. So there is now an actual international standard on adaptation. So people can go and look at that standard and utilize that. And there are more and more folk who are now training people to be certified to utilize that standard in organizations. So I think there's now quite a few avenues. I guess the issue is whether there should be, for example, a particular one for SMEs. There's a sort of an SME climate hub. There could definitely be a role there. I think mostly that's been focused on mitigation and net zero, but there could definitely be a role to provide, for example, guidance for SMEs, I think, in the future. But do you want to add anything, Louise?
Yeah, thanks, Suraj. I guess I'll just add the point that, the first step for many businesses depends on where you're starting from. And so what we've seen in this report and what we see generally is that, that first step can look very, very different depending on your sector, depending on the size of your business or your organisation, depending on your capacity and the capability which you have within your business or your organisation. So I think what's really needed and what the UK, does do quite well is a sort of range of different places for people to either initially engage if they're starting off, on their journey, which this report showed us that a lot of businesses, in terms of adaptation, they're really right at the beginning of this, all the way through to, some sectors, finance sector, for example, the water sector can be a bit of an exemplar of this, who are quite advanced in how they take in new climate information and translate that into risks and hazards and come up with their adaptation plan. And so what I think there is possibly an opportunity for here is some sort of enhanced knowledge exchange where we can learn, from where sectors are more advanced or from businesses that have already gone some of the way along this journey, to share those learnings with those who are just starting out. And there are, as Suraj described, there's a couple of initiatives on this. Another one is the Goal 13 platform, where businesses share with each other their adaptation plans, kind of like a way for the community to learn together and to build their competency and capacity together.
Great, thanks, Louise. That's really good. I know you're sort of in the heat of the moment as panelists, but if you have an opportunity to upload any websites for some of these organisations or risk management tools that you're mentioning, then please do that. But otherwise, I guess people can Google them from hearing the names of them. There's a second question from David Harkin in Historic Environment Scotland, where it's very similar to the previous question. He's asking about what would be the panelists' top tips for integrating and mainstreaming assessments of climate risk across organisations such as a public sector body. Is this something that people without specialist knowledge on climate risks and impacts can do, or do we need to invest in new skills? So we've already heard a little bit about where the first port of call is. Could you reflect a little bit on how an organisation might get to grips with it? Does it need to bring in external consultants and advice, or do you think that there are initial steps that organisations can take without really needing to bring in technical skills and support? Maybe Katie, could you have a stab at that, or Suraj, Nicola, maybe?
Yeah, I I can potentially comment from the perspective of dealing with the adaptation reporting power and how organisations approach their adaptation reports. I mean, a good number of them do use consultants, do use external consultants to help support them in producing that report. But I suppose it doesn't need to be as sophisticated as some of the biggest infrastructure providers, you know, may wish to be doing their climate risk assessment. If you're a small business, it may really be sufficient that you have that conversation, you know, with your colleagues as part of your wider conversations around risk, and just sort of thinking about where your premises are located, you know, how well adapted your building is, if you look after staff well-being, and the various other things that will come up when you start to think about climate risk management. And you know, the risks are set out in the Climate Change Committee's risk assessment at quite a high level, so that could be a good sort of start of that conversation. So I think it really does depend on the type of business that you are, you know, and whether you've done this sort of thing before. But I think any conversation is better than no conversation, and you know, any kind of consideration of these things is better than sort of not doing it at all. And even if you're at the very beginning of the journey, it's certainly a journey kind of worth starting.
Yeah, great. I think it's a really important message is to be thinking about what suits your particular context. So for some small organisations who are making decisions that only have lifetimes over quite limited period of time, it may not be super crucial for them to look at very long-term timescales. But organisations that are making multi-million-pound decisions about long-lasting infrastructure, they really do need to be getting to grips with some of these issues and the sorts of changes that we're likely to see in the future. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next question then, which comes from Johanna Nalo at Griffith University. And Johanna's asking primarily Suraje, but others can come in on this. Perhaps Denise might be able to help us with it. Were there any questions to organisations that talked about how they were going about measuring climate adaptation within their particular organisations? Denise, I see you nodding there.
Yeah, hi.
Chip in.
Thanks, Johanna, for this question. So there were a number of questions that were open-ended within our survey that we did not get to analyze and fully compute for this report, but some of them included what type of adaptation measures has your organization invested in or will invest in, and these are open-ended questions that we're in the process of analyzing, and I think would speak to the question that you're asking. But there are also other open-ended questions that dealt with generally how organizations responded and looked at adaptation in general. So hopefully in the future, this would be additions to the reports and to the results that we can complement this report.
Great, thanks, Denise. So we've got two questions in from Stella Whittaker, who's with the Copenhagen Business School, a PhD fellow working around climate finance and urban adaptation. They're both quite challenging questions, and so I'll let you volunteer as to who goes first with them. But the first one is about you know, what is an acceptable level of adaptation effort? Are there any benchmarks out there for desired levels of activity? Of course, it's going to be locally specific, but Stella is grappling in her research to find benchmarks. So any comments about that? You know, how do we know we've done enough, or what is enough?
May I have a little crack at that?
Yeah.
And hopefully my answer wouldn't disagree with the other panelists, but I would say what is an acceptable level of adaptation effort? And you know, firstly, there is no acceptable level of adaptation effort. It's very dependent on a particular community, a particular country, and their attitudes to risk. So I'm sure, Stella, as you've been looking at different countries, you'll see that very different countries have very, very different attitudes to risk. And, you know, the famous one is the Netherlands that protects some of its infrastructure to a 1 in 10,000 year event, whereas in New York, they barely protect Manhattan to a 1 in 100 year event. And this is influenced by many factors, including cultural factors, just political factors that are different between different areas. One area I would encourage to look at, which I found quite informative, is to look at how governments assess, or how any different decision makers assess different projects, different adaptation investments, because you'll see their sort of individual benchmarks, their acceptable level of adaptation is sort of implicitly embedded in there. So for example, in the UK, we have quite a clear framework for when we do and don't invest in a flood defence, for example, a clear set of thresholds that have to be in terms of the number of people protected, the cost benefit of that particular investment. So that can be a really strong indication of what a particular society accepts in terms of its risk, because if you're less than that number of people, then you don't build the flood defense in theory, and so that gives you a sense of that benchmark. But it is very dependent, and it's not even, most governments will set standards like that, but for different organizations, it's very different attitudes to risk as well. Different types of firms will have very different attitudes. So I'm sorry, there's no easy answer to that question.
It's a really good question and a really difficult one to answer. I think you've done really well there, Nicola. So I'm going to move on to the next question and just frame that in the sense of what is enough. Well, of course, we can make it a requirement and a mandatory expectation that organisations have to report on their risk exposure, and therefore there would be a legal threshold in that sense as to what you need to do. Given that, Stella also asks about whether we think organisations are ready for, in this example, the EU taxonomy and the adaptation disclosure requirements, similar things coming in the UK setting as well, where quantification of any kind is really difficult. What do you think the response will be in organisations for this type of request and requirement? Who would like to have a go at that? I mean, this is setting up potentially a lot of demand for organisations to need to do this. So there are the information requirements, there are the processes, there are the risk perceptions, and so on. All sorts of interesting dimensions to this that we're going to have to face over the next couple of years. Who'd like to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I'm happy to kickstart the discussion, Declan, because I think this question also links up a little bit with David's question, which I wanted to come back to about investment in new skills. And I think it connects a lot with what Nicola was talking about in her intervention. So it'd be good to hear more about this particular topic, which is, I mean, in effect, we now have so we have, the report shows that many organizations are unprepared, but what we've got coming is really from government. I mean, assuming the roadmap for mandatory climate disclosures gets accepted, is that everyone in the land will have to prepare for climate change. I mean, it will eventually it'll start off with the very big companies, and then by 2025, everyone in the land will have to prepare. So you will have to assess the physical risk of climate change plus the transition risks. And in sort of to try to answer David's question a little bit, I mean, from where I'm sitting, I don't feel that, the country's got all the skills out there. I mean, we really need a lot more graduates that can, operate in this kind of space of climate services, translating climate information into something that can be useful for an organization. So I think, to again answer a little bit of David's question, I think if an organization is very big, they probably have the capacity to incorporate climate change into their planning. But if you're a small SME, you're not going to be able to do that internally. You might have to hire someone, or you might just have to get a little bit of guidance from, SME Climate Hub. So at least from where I sit, and be interesting to hear other people's comments, I think there's a massive shortage of skills for the demand that's going to materialize very, very soon in terms of disclosing physical risks in this space, and I think we need to invest heavily here, and that obviously will then help prepare organizations for climate change. And I hadn't even thought about the unintended consequences that Nicola had kind of raised, like, okay, prices will then go up and that will have an impact, and you need public policy to deal with that. So I think there's a big area for investment here, I think, on climate services that can translate this. And part of that, I think, will also be some of these, cascading risks that come from overseas that affect supply chains. But it'd be good to hear other people's views on this one.
We don't have a lot of time, but if anyone would like to come in on this, Nicola, I saw your hand then. Yeah.
Yeah, well, maybe just to mention about the EU taxonomy. So the EU taxonomy for adaptation it's a really interesting and massive advance in this whole area of trying to promote adaptation across society, and it's important for a number of reasons, and a lot of people are critical of the EU taxonomy, and certainly there are a lot of problems in actually implementing it, and there are a lot of risks as well. But one of the really powerful things, which actually goes beyond TCFD, so TCFD, Task Force for Climate Related Financial Disclosures, requires firms to disclose their physical climate risks, so the risks of the climate to them. What the EU taxonomy does is it goes beyond that. So it requires firms not just to think about the impact of climate to them, but the impact that they are having on the resilience of communities around them. And it has a strong mandate on do no significant harm. So it requires firms, and this is an even bigger challenge in terms of the analysis, it requires firms to demonstrate that they are doing no significant harm in terms of impacting the resilience of communities around them or whole societies. So you can imagine if you're a very water intensive firm, potentially you need to demonstrate that you're not affecting the water security of the communities around you. And that's really important. And I say it goes beyond TCFD, because I think that's what will take us more towards sort of whole of society resilience and sort of better capturing these externalities that are happening that could impact on the resilience of others. So it's a very it's one, I would say, one of the most advanced in the world on this, because it does go beyond just physical risk. But the implementation is definitely going to be a challenge. And I think another really powerful thing about the EU taxonomy is so it's applied to things like disclosure, but it's also applied to things like resilience bonds. So it creates a market for new financial products for adaptation. So if you're designing a resilience bond, for example, you can say, okay, our resilience bond meets the EU taxonomy, and that creates this market for then investors to come in and be able to finance these types of measures. So it's definitely going to be a challenge for people to report against this, but it's a very important piece of regulation, to my mind.
Great, Nicola. Very comprehensive, very up-to-date answer. Lots of things in there that I haven't heard about yet. So super. It does strike me that when you track back over time and the way we have approached adaptation, I think that the policy instruments and some of the mandatory requirements are really where we've had to grapple with these practical and implementation issues and force us to think about how do we get to grips with understanding risk and thinking about acting on that risk. So that's very much at the sort of cutting edge. And with a lot of new requirements coming through, the next 4 or 5 years are going to be very interesting to see how we land this and whether we've got the capacity to do it. So I have to wrap up there. We're on the hour, and it just remains for me to say a huge thank you to Suraje for presenting. A thank you to our 3 panelists for really insightful comments and for taking the time to get involved in this. Thank you so much. Thanks also to Denise for lead author of the report, and for coming in and helping us on that question. So thanks very much. There's some information in the Q&A in terms of links that you can follow up. If you'd like to follow up with Suraje or I, email us after the event, and we will be uploading this as soon as possible on the website. So with that, we will end, and thanks everybody for joining. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Declan. Thanks for sharing. Bye.